Well, if Fillon does win the presidency, he may usher in policies that may change labor laws and introduce further fiscal bill tightening. For more on France's future and its economy, we're joined by Dominic Thomas from Los Angeles. He's chair of French studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dominic, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So, Dominic, France's economy does have a lot going for it. It is the third biggest in the EU. It's the sixth biggest in the world. But the unemployment is very high and the government's finances are weak. Growth has been very slow. About 10% of the workforce in France is unemployed. You compare that to 4.3% across the border in Germany. Why is unemployment so high?
Well, thank you for having me on. I think that France, as you just mentioned, has gone through a series of dramatic moments in recent history. Of course, the recent attacks have caused significant problems to the tourism industry. The economy has been stagnant and unemployment has been extremely high. This is linked to a whole range of issues that have been discussed in the recent primaries in France. Many of these have to do with tremendous protectionism in the workplace and so on. And unemployment is at over 10%. Young people are seeking opportunities elsewhere in the world. And France's socialist government has been unable to essentially reboot the economy after the great global crisis, which actually France did fairly well in, but its growth rates are appalling. And France's, I think, competitiveness internationally is not there. There's an over-reliance on the service sector. There are certain industries such as cosmetics, luxury goods, train, aerospace that have been doing very well. But France has not adequately responded to the great challenges of globalization and has certainly not invested enough in new digital technologies and into the new kinds of workplace flexibility that will attract young people.
Dominic, certainly a number of challenges facing the French economy. Now, Francois Fillon just won the Conservative presidential primary. He's a big supporter of a free market. He is pledging some dramatic economic reforms, including slashing public jobs, ending the 35-hour week, scrapping the wealth tax, raising the retirement age to 65, and he also wants to end early pension rights. Now, this is very much against what is seen as the French way. So how are the French responding to this?
Right. Well, the very interesting thing about it is that he's perceived as being a kind of pioneer who wants to move in these new directions, but he himself has embraced the name of being a kind of Thatcherite, which in so many ways is interesting. I mean, of course, this sort of breaking down of the public sector, changing of the retirement age and so on, all fit into that. But Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979. This was a decade before the end of the Cold War, before we were really talking about globalization. So I think that there's a disconnect really between the sorts of policies he's advocating and the realities of this new world. He hasn't addressed the question of international competitiveness. He's not talking about the role of France in this new kind of globalized world. And in fact, although economic issues have proved so far important in the run-up to the general elections in spring 2017, it's more the malaise, the disillusionment and the frustration of voters that I think have driven the election thus far and been reflected in the sorts of things Fillon has been embracing in terms of policy.
Well, Dominic, you mentioned Thatcherism and the issues with the public and the private sector. And the private sector is crowded out in France because around 58% of France's GDP is swallowed up by state spending. France is maxed out on state spending and has maxed out in debt. And as you said, Fillon is a very vocal supporter of the economic policies of Margaret Thatcher. Is there a strong case to be made that France does indeed need a dose of Thatcherism?
I think that that's going to be a difficult argument to make. As I said, that this is a sort of an economic model that goes back now almost 40 years. That had questionable success in Britain. And I think that in terms of rethinking the French economy and the particular ways in which this is going to help young people, many leading economists have questioned this kind of approach. France rather, I think, needs to sort of address the greater questions that have shaped this debate so far, and Marine Le Pen has in fact already picked up on these, is the sorts of policies, this sort of attack on the welfare state, the reduction of taxes for corporations and for the wealthiest in French society, are unlikely unlikely to appeal to a broader electorate that already last year, when the socialists tried to change the work laws and introduce some sort of fairly mild transformations to that, have absolutely nothing compared to what François Fillon has been proposing. But as I just mentioned, the sorts of economic issues that he's been dealing have not been really addressed that significantly in the run-up to this primary. It is rather the shift towards talking about values of national identity and so on that are much closer to the Front National's territory that ultimately, I think, resulted in François Fillon's nomination as the leader of the Les Républicains to go into the spring 2017 elections.
Well, Dominic, if these major market reforms and regulation changes that Fillon wants to implement are not, in fact, implemented, and France does continue on this more socialist path that it's on, what is your projection for the country?
Right. Well, I'm not sure that the projected path of continuing on is going to be a socialist path. France has been moving increasingly in terms of the electorate, regional elections and so on, towards the right. The interesting thing is going to be is that François Fillon was elected or appointed as an outcome of this primary to lead Les Républicains in an election, an entire election that has been shaped by a kind of protectionist, let's make France great again, vision of a traditional France that Marine Le Pen has embraced. The question ultimately is going to be whether or not François Fillon's base of supporters are going to tolerate him opening up towards the center and towards the left, which is going to require him to abandon some of these claims that he's made about the welfare state, the attack on public servants and so on, or whether or not he's going to be seen as a palatable candidate in the face of the views and positions of Marine Le Pen that he shares, except on the question of economics. And so her attack against him has been precisely the fact that his views and his positions are unlikely to appeal to the sort of working class, trade union protected workers that are in France today and to which she has been increasingly appealing over the past 5 to 6 years.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dominic Thomas, Chair of French Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles.